Hello, it's the Cultured Genie. The criticism of Mearsheimer and his views on Russia's invasion and aggression will be just like my criticism of Seyhan, in that I am not saying that either of these people, Seyhan or Mearsheimer, are incompetent, just that I think they are wrong in this issue. It is not a general critique of their capabilities as analysts. With that said, now let's get to the famous real politics analyst John Mearsheimer and his views upon the politics surrounding Russia's aggression and invasion of Ukraine. Now, before we begin to discuss Mearsheimer's specific views about Russia, it is important to understand that Mearsheimer places a great importance upon real politics. That is to say, he sees international politics as having no morals, just interests and contests of power in various fields and areas. Power, not morals, is important, and the important part is to get more powerful and to protect your interests that guarantee your power as a state in the international order that is inherently chaotic and dangerous, as all other players are trying to expand their own power and at the expense of other powers in order to guarantee their own security and power. Now, this video will not be a criticism of real politics, as that will require an entirely different kind of video. I will actually accept this worldview, or rather theoretical framework, but I will still criticize Mearsheimer on this specific issue using this sort of worldview. So with that said, let's begin with Mearsheimer's view about Russia and its place in the world with regards to Ukraine. The first point that Mearsheimer often speaks about is that Russia is a natural ally against China, as there exists competing interests about territorial claims between Russia and China, and the USA does not have many real significant interests that are going against Russia directly, but does have many interests that do go against China, and thus China is a main rival to compete against for the United States. Hence, Russia should have been won over by being given concessions, rather than the USA trying to antagonize Russia by, for example, going against Russian interests in Ukraine. The second point made by Mearsheimer is that Russia's sphere of influence has been violated, as Ukraine is of vital strategic importance to Russia, and thus it is a vital interest to Russia. Number 3. Ukraine's will or sovereignty does not matter in international politics with regards to Russia's will, as it is weak in comparison to Russia. Number 4. The United States of America has no vital interests in Ukraine, according to Mearsheimer. Number 5. Nukes are dangerous and Russia could use them if the USA gets too involved in the Ukraine-Russian war and Russia feels pressured. These points were made by Mearsheimer for his arguments about why the USA should have stayed out of Ukraine and now out of the Ukraine-Russian war. I will now present my arguments against Mearsheimer's arguments. First, about Russia being a natural ally against China. My argument is that Russia's regime and its structure of being an undemocratic state makes it a natural ally to China against the democracies of the West, as the democracies of the West have proven to be very fickle and can, in the worst case, become critical and undermine Putin's regime if idealists are elected, or if conditions become so that anti-Putin politicians get more power in the Western democracies. In comparison, China is a stable type of dictatorship that is not likely to support revolutionary democratic movements within Russia and thus be a threat to Putin's power. And getting closer to China would also ensure safety for Russia against getting attacked by China, as China would have an ally against the United States and they would have their northern borders secured from invasion, as any invasion from the north would have to go through Russia first before getting to China. China is also much more likely to be an aggressive threat against Russia than the democracies in the West, as the democracies in the West have politicians who need to win popularity contests in order to get re-elected, and you will not get popular and re-elected if you start a large-scale aggressive war without good reason against Russia. Consequently, in order to secure the security of Russia, getting closer to China achieves greater border security than getting closer to the Western democracies, and by extension the United States. I thus disagree with Mearsheimer on this point. On the second point regarding Russia's sphere of influence, it can easily be argued that Russia's sphere has been violated from their point of view. However, that does not mean that others have to accept their point of view or accept Russia's interests. Description is not the same as prescription, and just because Russia has these interests does not mean that others have to appease them, as that is based solely upon power relationships. But I will accede to the correctness of this point on a purely descriptive basis with regards to Russia's point of view. The third point, that Ukraine's will or sovereignty does not matter as it is weak in comparison to Russia, has been proven to be false. Firstly, Ukraine has proved to be more powerful militarily than expected, and has lasted longer than anyone could have expected, and has also even succeeded in driving the Russians back through help from several Western countries, and also other, smaller, Eastern countries who are aligned against Russia. Here it is important to know that even in real politics, not all power is brute force. Power can come in many different forms. And Ukraine, through diplomatic contacts and through great use of diplomacy, has managed to get a lot of support from around the world, especially from other smaller countries that have interests that are aligned against Russian interests. Because it should be remembered that even if countries are weak separately in comparison to Russia, when they are together and united in common interests against Russia, they are in certain regards actually stronger than Russia. Especially if you consider the European Union to be a powerful entity, because the European Union does not have an interest in a strong Russia that will be a main competitor to it. And thus Ukraine, in comparison to Russia, cannot that easily be dismissed as being weak. It is just that Ukraine has turned out to have different sources of power than just brute military force standing alone, like Russia, and has managed to create diplomatic ties that have given a lot of diplomatic power that has translated into military aid for it. And on the subject of the EU not wanting a strong Russia, this brings me to the next point, which is that the USA has no vital interests in Ukraine. Sure, in Ukraine itself they might not have that many vital interests, but like the EU, they have an interest in stopping Russian expansion or retention of power if it is not amendable to being an ally, and is in fact an expansionist power that will naturally get closer to China anyway. And weakening Russia weakens the threat faced by American allies in Europe in a potential future world war against China. Also, those allies of the USA in Europe that are close to Russia might not feel safe or confident enough to lend support to the United States in case of a war with China in the United States' time of need, if Russia gets stronger after it's done with Ukraine. It is also important to note that even if Russia does not get closer to China or joins China in any alliance, a stronger Russia in itself also means a potential new rival to the USA's political power, a rival that could expand even further in the future. Mearsheimer focuses only on the interests of Russia with regards to NATO expansion and the threat that Russia must feel from NATO expanding and Ukraine getting closer to the USA and NATO, or thinks that everything that happens is a reaction to the USA and NATO. However, Russia already bordered NATO through the Baltic states and Norway, which could have been used to stage invasions or attacks on Russia. Mearsheimer overlooks the fact that there exist other strong and powerful interests for Russia to expand its borders and its power too, by getting more land, more people and more resources under it. It's not simply a reaction. Russia can be proactive and want to increase its power too. And these are interests that the USA has a vital interest in Russia not achieving, as the USA has no interest in facing the USSR 2.0 back at full strength again. Not to mention that letting Russia expand would also make the USA look weak in comparison, which would affect American power and influence. On the subject of looking weak, this also ties in with the point about nukes. Regarding nukes, they are a suicide weapon due to mad or mutually assured destruction, and thus not something that is likely to be utilized by Russia, as it would destroy their own power. Also, giving in to nuclear threats coming from Russia and doing concessions would give other powers reasons to get nukes and use them as tools of intimidation, which is something the USA, as one of the few countries with nukes, has no interest in allowing. And thus, Putin's threats about nuclear war had to be faced with consequences, or else the United States would have looked weak, which would have led others to conclude that getting nukes had greater benefits than the costs associated with them. And more intimidation would have come later by other actors, or by Russia itself. And in the end, nukes and the threat of nuclear war would have made the USA and other political actors, if they gave into these threats, into slaves, thus powerless against these actors having nukes if they allowed the threats to change their policy. And this is the worst case scenario you can ever be in a real politics scenario, which is powerless and subject to another's whims, which is the case if you should always give in to the threat of nuclear war and change your policy in accordance with that threat. Though, to be somewhat fair to Mearsheimer, he would probably argue that you should not stand back when you have vital interests that are threatened. However, that just pushes up the timeline for putting the foot down, as if you give in to one threat, more will come, until eventually you will come to a point where you can't give in to those threats anyway. Then it is just better to not give in the first time. Thus, Russia's threats about nukes need to be handled with care, but they should not be grounds to give concessions. As again, the USA is not the only player in politics, and everything Russia does is not simply a reaction to the United States, but they are a proactive part in my view, and so are also many lesser entities on the political stage in international politics, which is also why I think that Mearsheimer overlooks a lot of the smaller, weaker nations, and that they can have their own interests which can align with each other, and also, due to various situations and reasons, have a far greater influence and power, or potential for power and influence, than most would assume at first, including Mearsheimer. This is the same issue as Mearsheimer viewing Ukraine as being weak, but now with various third parties that are not directly involved in this Ukraine-Russian war, and now with nukes, as you don't have to be a very powerful nation to get a lot of power if you get nukes, so you want to de-incentivize it, and thus giving in to nuclear threats from Russia does the opposite. These were my thoughts about Mearsheimer and his arguments with regards to Ukraine, where I think he's terribly wrong. But you, my viewers, might disagree. If you have any questions or disagreements, please post them in the comment section. I would love to hear them and discuss this. And please also like this video as it helps with the algorithm. Also, I would like to end with a quote from Mearsheimer regarding the Ukraine situation from before the war. If you really want to wreck Russia, what you should do is to encourage it to try to conquer Ukraine. Putin is much too smart to try that. Please do subscribe as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities. اشترك بالقناة من فضلكم.